I never expected a simple house tour to rip my carefully built life apart in under 10 minutes. But when Anthony turned to me in that empty living room and said, "Bryce, you're not here just for square footage, are you?" The air between us thickened like it had been waiting years for that exact moment. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I actually stepped back and bumped into the kitchen island. He didn't laugh. He didn't look away. He just waited like he already knew the answer I had spent 28 years refusing to speak out loud. The house itself was perfect on paper, a 3-bedroom Craftsman in Capitol Hill with original hardwood floors and a backyard big enough for the dog I didn't even own yet. I had told the agency I was a single professional ready to settle down after years of bouncing between apartments. What I hadn't told anyone was that settle down felt like a foreign language lately. My last relationship with a woman named Claire had ended 6 months earlier, not because she was terrible, but because every time she kissed me I felt like I was performing a role written by someone else. Anthony, the broker assigned to me, was supposed to be just another name on a clipboard. Instead, he showed up in dark jeans, a crisp white button-down, and a smile that somehow made the morning Seattle rain feel irrelevant. We had been walking through the rooms for 20 minutes making small talk about commute times and property taxes when he stopped in the master bedroom. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, painting stripes across the floor. He ran his hand along the windowsill and said quietly, "I used to think buying a house meant I was finally normal. Then I realized normal was the cage I built myself." The words landed like stones in still water. I laughed nervously, trying to steer us back to neutral ground. "Sounds like you've been through some stuff." He turned fully toward me, then his brown eyes steady. "We all have. The question is whether we keep pretending or start telling the truth." That was the moment the hook sank in. I felt exposed, stripped down to the version of myself I only ever met alone at 3 in the morning, scrolling through articles about men who finally came out in their late 20s. Anthony didn't push. He simply nodded toward the hallway and said, "Let's check the basement. The previous owners left a wine rack you might like." We walked in silence, but the silence wasn't empty anymore. It hummed. By the time we reached the bottom step, my palms were sweating. He flipped on the light, and there it was, just the two of us in a cool concrete room that smelled faintly of cedar and possibility. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "You know, Bryce, most clients talk nonstop about what they want in a home. You've barely said 10 sentences, and yet I feel like I already know the real reason you're here." My throat tightened. I wanted to bolt up the stairs, get in my car, and pretend this conversation had never started. Instead, I heard myself ask, "And what reason is that?" Anthony's voice dropped softer. "The same reason I took this listing, even though it's below my usual commission. Because something told me the guy walking through that door today might need more than a real estate agent." The confession didn't come in a rush of dramatic music or tears. It came in the quiet way he described his own coming out at 22, how his conservative family in Spokane still sent Christmas cards addressed only to him, never to any partner, how he had learned to read the small hesitations in a client's voice the way others read blueprints. Every word he spoke peeled another layer off the armor I had worn since college, when I dated girls to make my father proud and told myself the tightness in my chest was just stress. When he finished, he didn't ask me to reciprocate. He simply said, "Take your time, Bryce. Houses aren't the only things that need foundations rebuilt." I stood there staring at the wine rack like it held all the answers. My phone buzzed in my pocket, my brother Derek texting about Sunday dinner, and whether I was bringing Claire, even though I had told him we broke up. The contrast hit me like a slap. Here in this basement with a stranger who somehow saw me clearer than my own blood, I felt the first crack in the dam. Anthony waited patiently, giving me space the way only someone who had once stood exactly where I was standing could. Finally I managed, "I think I need to see the backyard again." It was the lamest deflection in history, but he nodded like it made perfect sense. We stepped outside into the damp Seattle air. The backyard was small but private, fenced by tall cedars. Anthony pointed out the perfect spot for a fire pit, then casually added, "I built one just like that at my place in Ballard. Helped a lot during the nights I couldn't sleep after my first boyfriend left. He wasn't selling the house anymore. He was offering me a map out of the maze I had been lost in for years. I looked at him, then really looked the way you do when the world suddenly tilts and you realize the person in front of you might be the first safe place you've ever found. By the time we finished the tour, I had signed the offer paperwork with shaking hands. Not because I was sure about the house, but because I was sure about one thing. Something had shifted the second Anthony said my name like it mattered. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him standing on the porch watching me go. For the first time in my life, the reflection staring back didn't feel like a stranger. Felt like the beginning. 3 days later, the offer was accepted and Anthony called to schedule the final walkthrough before closing. I told myself it was just business. My pulse disagreed. When I pulled up to the house, he was already there leaning against his black SUV in a navy sweater that made his shoulders look unfairly broad. He greeted me with the same easy smile, but his eyes held a question I wasn't ready to answer yet. "Ready to make it official, Bryce?" he asked, and I swear the double meaning wasn't in my head. Inside, the empty rooms echoed our footsteps. We moved from space to space, checking outlets and closet doors, but the real conversation happened in the pauses. He told me about the time he had almost proposed to a guy named Marcus, only to discover Marcus was still married to a woman back in Chicago. I told him about Claire, how kind she was, and how guilty I felt for wasting her time. The words poured out easier than I expected. By the time we reached the backyard again, the sun had broken through the clouds, painting everything gold. Anthony stopped at the spot where the fire pit would go and said quietly, "You don't have to figure it all out today. But you do have to stop lying to yourself at some point. Trust me, I waited too long once and almost lost the chance to be happy." That night I couldn't sleep. I sat on my apartment balcony replaying every moment of the tour. Anthony hadn't touched me, hadn't made a single advance, yet his honesty had cracked me open wider than any kiss ever could. The next morning I texted him asking if he had time for coffee to go over closing details. He replied within minutes, "There's a great little place near the house. Meet you there at 10. The cafe smelled of fresh espresso and rain. Anthony arrived in jeans and a leather jacket, looking more like the guy you'd meet at a hiking trail than a broker. We talked about everything and nothing: the Mariners season, the new exhibit at the Chihuly Garden, my irrational fear of basements after that first tour. Then, without warning, he asked, "Have you told anyone yet?" I froze mid-sip. No one had ever been direct with me like that. I shook my head. He nodded once like he had expected the answer. "When you're ready, I'll be here. No pressure. Just remember, you're not the first man to feel like the world will end if the truth comes out. It doesn't. It just changes." His words stayed with me through the closing process, through the movers hauling boxes into the new house, through the first night I spent alone in the master bedroom listening to the quiet creak of settling wood. On the third night I called him. Not for house advice. Just to talk. We stayed on the phone for 2 hours. He told me about his little sister who still sent him memes every Sunday, and his dad who hadn't spoken to him since the day he came out. I told him about Derek, my older brother who had taken our father's side after Mom died, and how I was terrified of losing the only family I had left. When we finally hung up, I felt lighter than I had in years. The first weekend in the house, Anthony showed up with a bottle of wine and a housewarming gift, a small fire pit kit he had ordered online. "Figured we should test it out before the weather turns," he said with a grin. We spent the evening assembling it in the backyard, laughing when the instructions made no sense. As the flames crackled to life, he sat beside me on the patio chairs, close enough that our knees brushed. The touch was accidental yet electric. Neither of us moved away. That was the night everything shifted from possibility to certainty. We didn't kiss. We didn't need to. The conversation flowed deeper than before until Anthony looked at me across the fire and said, "Bryce, I'm not going to pretend I don't feel something here. But I also know you're still figuring out who you are. So I'll wait. As long as it takes." His honesty should have scared me. Instead, it felt like the first time someone had seen the real me and decided I was worth staying for. The following weeks blurred into a comfortable rhythm. Anthony helped me paint the guest room. I cooked dinner for him using the fancy stove I had bragged about during the tour. We talked about movies, music, the ridiculous price of Seattle real estate, and slowly the heavier topics: my fear of being seen as less than by my family, his lingering pain from past relationships. One evening, after a particularly long day at my architecture firm, I came home to find him waiting on the porch with takeout Thai food. "You sounded tired on the phone," he explained simply. No grand gesture, just quiet care that chipped away at every wall I had built. Yet the world outside our little bubble kept pressing in. Derek called more often, asking when I was bringing someone new around. My coworkers joked about setting me up with their single female friends. Each innocent comment felt like a reminder that the truth I was circling closer to every day could explode everything. Anthony never pushed, but he also never hid who he was. When we ran into his friend at the farmer's market, he introduced me without hesitation as Bryce, my favorite client turned friend. The ease in his voice made me ache for the same freedom. One rainy Saturday, we drove to the coast just to clear our heads. Walking along the empty beach, Anthony stopped and turned to me. "I need you to know I'm falling for you, Bryce. Not the version you show the world. The real one." The wind whipped around us, carrying his words straight into my chest. I wanted to say it back. The words were there, lodged behind years of fear. Instead, I reached out and took his hand. It was the first time I had ever held another man's hand in public, even if the public was just seagulls and crashing waves. His fingers tightened around mine, and for that moment the rest of the world disappeared. The first crack appeared at my niece's birthday party 2 weeks later. Derek had invited the whole family to his backyard in Bellevue. I brought Anthony as the broker who helped me buy the house, which technically wasn't a lie but felt like one anyway. My brother clapped him on the shoulder too hard, the way straight guys do when they're sizing someone up. "So Anthony, you got a wife and kids, or what?" The question landed like a grenade. Anthony smiled politely and said, "No wife, no kids. Just me and my dog Max." Derek laughed like it was a joke. I felt sick. Later in the kitchen, Derek cornered me while I refilled drinks. "That guy seems a little too friendly, Bryce. You sure he's not trying to sell you more than a house?" The accusation hung there, unspoken but clear. I laughed it off, but inside something twisted. That night, after everyone left, Anthony drove me home in silence. When we pulled into my driveway, he finally spoke. "I'm sorry if I made things awkward. I can stay away from family stuff if it helps." His voice was gentle, but I heard the hurt underneath. I reached over and squeezed his hand. "No, I want you there. I just don't know how to tell them yet." The next month brought more tests. My firm landed a big project that required late nights and weekend work. Anthony understood, but I could feel the distance growing each time I canceled plans. One Friday, he showed up at my office with coffee and a note that read, "You're allowed to have a life outside these walls." The gesture should have warmed me. Instead, it highlighted how much I was still hiding. That evening, I finally said the words out loud to my reflection in the bathroom mirror. "I'm gay." They didn't feel as terrifying as I had imagined. They felt true. I called Anthony immediately after. He answered on the first ring. "I think I'm ready to tell Derek," I said before I could lose my nerve. The line went quiet for a second, then he replied, "Whatever you decide, I'm right here beside you." His support gave me the courage I needed. I invited my brother over for dinner the following weekend. Anthony offered to stay away, but I asked him to come. "I want him to meet the person who helped me find myself," I told him. Dinner started fine. We grilled steaks, talked about the Seahawks. Then Derek asked how the house was treating me. I took a deep breath and said, "Actually, there's something I need to tell you. Anthony isn't just my broker. He's important to me. Really important." The silence that followed stretched so long I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. Derek set his fork down slowly. "You're telling me you're gay, Bryce? After all these years?" His voice wasn't angry yet, but the disappointment was worse. Anthony sat perfectly still beside me, offering silent strength. The conversation exploded from there. Derek brought up Dad's old sermons about family values, how Mom would have been heartbroken. I tried to explain that this wasn't a choice, it was who I had always been. He didn't hear me. He stood up, pushed his chair back, and said, "I need time, Bryce. I can't pretend this is okay right now." The door slammed behind him, leaving Anthony and me in the wreckage of what I had hoped would be understanding. That night Anthony held me on the couch while I shook with the kind of tears I hadn't cried since Mom's funeral. "You were brave," he whispered against my hair. "Braver than I was at your age." His words didn't fix the ache, but they made it bearable. The next morning my phone buzzed with a text from Derek. "We're still family. But I don't know how to do this yet." It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't total rejection either. I showed the message to Anthony. He smiled softly. "That's more than I got from my dad for 2 years. Progress is progress, Bryce." The weeks that followed tested us both. Derek stopped answering calls. My coworkers started whispering when Anthony picked me up for lunch. Even my best friend from college reacted with awkward silence when I finally told him. Through it all, Anthony remained steady. He cooked me dinner on bad days, listened without judgment, and reminded me daily that my worth wasn't defined by other people's comfort. One evening, after a particularly rough therapy session, he took me to the backyard fire pit we had built together. "Remember the first night here?" he asked. "You were so scared. Look at you now." I looked at him, then the man who had walked into my life disguised as a real estate broker and somehow become my safe harbor. The firelight danced across his face and something inside me clicked into place. "I love you, Anthony," I said. The words came out simple and sure. He pulled me into his arms right there under the stars, and for the first time I wasn't thinking about who might see. I was only thinking about how right it felt. Summer turned to fall and the leaves in my backyard shifted from green to gold. Anthony and I fell into a rhythm that felt like home. Weekends were for farmers markets and long hikes in the Cascades. Weeknights were quiet dinners and conversations that stretched until the candles burned low. He introduced me to his circle of friends, a tight-knit group of gay men who had become family when blood failed them. For the first time I saw what chosen family could look like, and it gave me hope that maybe Derek would come around too. The turning point came in October when my firm hosted its annual charity gala. I had planned to go alone until Anthony said casually, "I could be your +1 if you want." The idea terrified me. Colleagues would see us together. There would be questions. But looking at the man who had stood by me through every panic attack and sleepless night, I realized I was tired of hiding. "I'd love that," I told him. The night of the gala I wore a charcoal suit. Anthony showed up in a deep burgundy jacket that made his eyes look almost amber. We walked into the ballroom hand in hand, and the world didn't end. A few people stared. Most smiled politely. My boss even pulled me aside later to say, "You look happy, Bryce. That's all that matters." The validation felt like oxygen after years underwater. On the drive home, Anthony kept glancing at me with a grin he couldn't contain. "You did it," he said softly. "You chose you. But life has a way of balancing highs with lows." 2 days later, Derek showed up at my door unannounced. His face was drawn like he hadn't slept. "I've been talking to Sarah," he said, referring to his wife. "She thinks I'm being an ass." He stepped inside and for the first time in months really looked at the house I had built with Anthony's help. "This place looks good on you, little brother." The conversation that followed wasn't perfect. There were awkward silences and more than a few defensive moments. But he stayed for 2 hours. When he left, he hugged me the way he used to when we were kids and said, "Bring Anthony to Thanksgiving if you want. We'll figure it out." I called Anthony immediately after. He listened to the whole story, then laughed with pure relief. "See? Foundations take time, but they hold." That Thanksgiving was messy and beautiful. Derek's kids asked innocent questions about why Uncle Bryce's friend didn't have a wife. Anthony answered them with the same patience he had shown me from day one. My father-in-law watched everything with tight lips but didn't cause a scene. It wasn't full acceptance yet, but it was a door cracked open instead of slammed shut. Winter brought its own challenges. Anthony's ex Marcus resurfaced, wanting to catch up. The timing couldn't have been worse. I had just started introducing Anthony to more of my extended family, and the last thing I needed was old ghosts stirring doubt. One night after Anthony told me about the coffee he had shared with Marcus, I felt the old fear creep back in. What if I wasn't enough? What if the life we were building was just another phase for him? He must have seen the panic in my eyes, because he took my face in his hands and said, "Bryce, you are not a phase. You are the first man who made me believe I could have everything I wanted without apology." The reassurance didn't erase the insecurity overnight, but it gave me the courage to talk about it instead of letting it fester. We spent the next weekend in a cabin on Whidbey Island talking through every fear, every past hurt. By the time we drove home, the snow had started falling and something between us felt stronger than before. Anthony pulled over on a quiet stretch of road and kissed me for the first time in public with the kind of slow certainty that made the world stop spinning. Snowflakes melted on our coats as I realized this was what I had been searching for all along. Not just love, but the freedom to love openly. Spring arrived with new beginnings. Anthony moved some of his things into the house officially. We planted a garden in the backyard and laughed when half the seeds refused to grow. My therapy sessions became less about shame and more about building the life I wanted. Derek started texting Anthony directly about Seahawks tickets like they were old friends. The small normal moments stacked up until they formed something solid. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Anthony turned to me and said, "Remember that first house tour?" I laughed. "How could I forget? You ruined my whole plan to stay closeted forever." He grinned. "Best commission I never cared about earning. The real test came when my company offered me a promotion that required relocating to Chicago for a year. The job was everything I had worked toward, a chance to lead my own design team on a major waterfront project. But it meant leaving the house, the life Anthony and I had built, and the fragile peace I had found with my family. I agonized over the decision for weeks. Anthony never pressured me one way or the other. He simply said, "Whatever you choose, I'm with you. Even if that means long distance or selling the house or starting over somewhere new." His words were the permission I needed to be honest with myself. The promotion was tempting, but the thought of waking up every morning without him felt unbearable. I turned it down. When I told Anthony, he didn't cheer or throw a party. He just pulled me close and whispered, "Thank you for choosing us." That night we lay in the backyard under a blanket of stars and talked about the future, not in vague terms but in concrete plans. A wedding, maybe not tomorrow but someday. Kids through adoption if we were lucky. Growing old together in this house we had both come to love. Summer brought visitors. Anthony's sister flew in from Spokane and for the first time met me as her brother's partner instead of just a name on a phone. She hugged me tight and said, "You make him happier than I've seen in years. Don't break his heart or I'll break you." The threat was delivered with a laugh, but I heard the love behind it. My own family progress continued in small steps. Derek helped us build a new deck over Labor Day weekend. He even asked Anthony for advice on surprising Sarah with a weekend getaway. Watching the two of them joke around felt like the final piece clicking into place. Yet growth isn't linear. Old doubts resurfaced when a colleague from my past ran into us at a restaurant and made a thinly veiled comment about lifestyle choices. The words stung more than I expected. That night, I snapped at Anthony over something trivial and we had our first real fight. He slept on the couch. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if I would ever stop caring what strangers thought. The next morning, he made coffee and sat beside me on the bed. "I'm not going anywhere, Bryce. But you have to stop punishing yourself for other people's ignorance." We talked until the sun came up, and by breakfast the anger had burned itself out, leaving only deeper understanding. Fall brought another milestone. Anthony proposed on the anniversary of our first house tour. He took me back to the empty living room where it all began, even though the house now belonged to us. He got down on one knee right where the wine rack still stood and said, "Bryce, you walked into this room scared and closed off. I want to spend the rest of my life watching you walk through every new door without fear." The ring was simple platinum with a small sapphire that matched the color of his eyes when he smiled. I said yes before he finished the sentence. The engagement party was small, just close friends and the family members who had chosen to show up. Derek gave a toast that started awkward and ended with actual tears. I was wrong, little brother. Love is love, and you too are proof. Anthony's father didn't come, but his sister brought a card from their mom that simply read, "I'm proud of the man you've become." The words meant more than either of us could say. Winter arrived with the kind of quiet joy I had never known was possible. We spent Christmas in the house we had once toured as strangers, now filled with lights, laughter, and the dog we had finally adopted, a rescue mutt named Max, who thought the fire pit was his personal throne. On New Year's Eve, Anthony and I stood on the new deck watching fireworks explode over the city. He wrapped his arms around me from behind and said, "Remember when you thought buying a house would fix everything?" I laughed. Turns out the house was just the beginning. You were the fix. The following spring we got married in the backyard under a canopy of string lights with the same fire pit crackling nearby. Derek walked me down the makeshift aisle. Anthony's sister was his best woman. There were tears, laughter, and the kind of easy happiness that comes after surviving every storm. When the officiant asked if we took each other as partners in life and love, I looked at the man who had once been nothing more than a name on a showing schedule and knew without doubt that every hard choice, every painful conversation had led exactly here. Years later, when people ask how we met, I still smile and say, "We were just looking at houses." But the truth is so much bigger. Anthony didn't just sell me a home. He helped me build one inside myself first. The journey wasn't clean or easy. There were family fights, identity crises, moments when I almost walked away from everything out of fear. But every single step taught me that love isn't about being perfect. It's about choosing each other even when the world makes it hard. Looking back at the man I was on that first rainy morning in an empty house, I barely recognize him. The Bryce who was terrified of his own reflection has been replaced by someone who knows exactly who he is and who he loves without apology. Anthony still teases me about how long it took me to admit it. I let him because he earned the right. Our life together isn't a fairy tale, but it's ours, real, messy, and profoundly beautiful. True or false? One private moment during a house tour can truly redefine your entire identity and future.